In this video, we'll talk about the SQL injection attack, or the SQL injection attack, which is a computer security attack on databases, and specifically relational databases that use SQL to communicate with them. And this attack it's actually a very common attack, and there are many, many examples of big applications that have been subjected to this attack. And part of your research is going to be looking into what are the consequences of such attacks. But the purpose of this video is actually to go over, in general, what a database is, how does it communicate with a web server, give you a little bit of background. Now, some of you may have taken databases or may have taken other classes that use database, such as the Web Frameworks class, but others of you may have never used a database and maybe have just heard the word. And so I'm hoping to kind of give you a little bit of instruction and give you a little bit of background on how databases work. So the if we think about web applications, right? So what I've got in here is a picture that shows a user, right? And you sit there by your browser and you type in a URL, right? So you open up your browser, your Firefox, your Chrome, right? And you type in a URL. And so maybe you type in something like, I don't know, http www.pacificu.edu, right? That's your URL. And you type that inside of your browser. Let's say you're using Firefox, okay, which is what you have on your VM. So when you type that in, right, that is going to send, as you know, if we talked about before, with shell shock and CSRF and other attacks, but that's going to send an HTTP request to some kind of web server, right? And the HTTP request is something like a GET or a POST request, right, which you have seen in the past. And then the web server, the web application server, will process that, and it will send a result, which is going to be what it gets displayed on your screen, right? And with a GET, it might just be just a simple web page. If you do some kind of forms and you type something in, maybe it's going to be some kind of POST request, and maybe, as we know with CSRF, that maybe there'll be some cross-site stuff going on, and it's pulling images from different locations, and that all gets sent back to the user, right? So that's kind of the simplified way that we've been looking at these. But sort of hidden in the background, which it used to all be that these would be on one machine. Of course, that's not how it is anymore. Everything's more distributed. But in the background, the web server is going to be communicating with the database. And the database, and you'll see this, by the way, this image where we do it as a sphere here, or as a cylinder, is this is how we always represent databases in flowcharts and things like that. Okay, and so with this database, what we do there is it stores all of the data, right? So things like if you think, let's go with the ELG server, right? So if you remember when we loaded up the Docker containers for running the ELG site, there was one Docker container which we never used, and that was the one that had all of the user information, right? So when we logged in as Sammy and used the password, or Bobby and used the password, and there was data inside of there, that was all stored in a database. And so the database is a way to organize the data for easy access and retrieval, right? So a lot of times with databases, you're going to hear about easy access and retrieval, okay? Okay, so so let's see. So let's kind of quickly summarize. So on the client side, we're presenting the content to the user, interacting with the user, and getting user input. On the web application side, we are generating, right? So if we're using PHP, we're generating web pages, but we're generating and delivering those back to the browser so that it's displayed to the user. And the database is used to store all of the database, right? We know that the browsers communicate with the web servers using the hypertext transfer protocol, right? That's what the HTTP is. And web servers communicate with the database using this language called SQL, or SQL, which stands for Standard Query Language. And what we're going to be studying or learning about today is attacks that go through the browser to the server which then get injected into the database. So the attack is on the database, but we're always going through the middleman, through the web server to that, okay? And if, as a user, you could, think about it as an attacker, what they're going to do is they're going to try to take advantage of these forms, similar to what we did with cross-site scripting, right, where we were kind of using the About Me form to inject code. So we're going to use this form to modify a query so that we can do things to the database over here. Some of it may just involve like looking at stuff that we're not supposed to, but some of it will involve modifying the database. So you could steal from the database, or you can modify the database. Okay. So let's kind of do a little bit of depth about databases, and again, just a little bit. So database is an organized collection of data. There are two kinds of databases, which I don't think I have a slide on here, but we have relational databases, right, which is one that use queries and keys, primary keys, and there's relationships between, they use tables and primary keys, and there's relationships between the tables, right? We break things up. And there's non-relational databases, which are more free-form, and they're basically, you kind of code them depending on the data that you have. There is a place for both of these, depending on what the application is. We're just going to focus on the relational databases that uses SQL or SQL, which is a structured query language. Okay, so the database attacks we're talking about here are relational database attacks. And the attacks are happening through the structured query language, or SQL. So basically what we're doing is you have to sort of know a bit about how SQL works in order to conduct the attack. So one of the things we'll be doing in this video and in class is we're going to work through some basic SQL commands. Okay. MySQL is an application, right? So SQL is the language, MySQL is the application. It's a open source relational database management system. So when I say database management system, it's talking about the actual application, the actual thing that's storing the database. And so that's what we mean with a database management system. I guess I would compare it to an IDE. So an IDE is an integrated development environment for, say, a language. So for example, Visual Studio is an IDE that can be used with C++. Okay, so here, MySQL is a database. The language you use inside of there is SQL, or it's a database management system, and then the language you're using is SQL. I've always found the name MySQL confusing because it doesn't seem like an actual product, but it is an actual product. Okay, now there's this the software stack that's called, let's see, it's called the LAMP software stack, and we use it for web stuff. And it stands for, I'm going to write it down here, it stands for Linux. So you have your OS as being Linux, Apache, and that's your web server. And then the M is for MySQL, which is the database management system. And then the P, well, stands for your favorite flavor of language. So it could be Perl, PHP, or Python. Okay. And so they just refer to that as a LAMP stack. And so you'll find that a lot of places that might use that are these sites over here. So WordPress uses MySQL, Google, Facebook, and so on and so forth, right? They use these as their backend. Okay. So again, this is just kind of giving you a little bit of background of how web services or how websites might be working. Okay, so for this next part of the video, what I want to do is actually give you a little walkthrough on the MySQL that is installed in on the lab setup, right? So when you load up when you're doing the lab, you're going to load up the Docker containers, and what you're going to find is there's going to be, let me do this. So you're going to have two Docker containers, right? So it's going to be two containers. One of the containers is going to be your web server. Okay, that's the one that's hosting the web pages, and the second one is going to be the database server. Okay, and the database server in this case is a MySQL database. And so what you're going to do is you're then going to log into that database server, which is what you see over here. And so right now, when you see this root at, I'm logged into the database server. Okay, and it's just a regular server. For example, you see here, if I type ls, there we are. We're just got just a regular Linux server. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do, though, since this is hosting our data, is we're going to log into MySQL. And so we do that by typing MySQL -u. We're going to -u is a user. We're going to log in as root, and the -p, the password, is going to be these. So we're logging in as root. Oops, we should have kept that next to each other. Oh, shoot. Let's try it again. MySQL, this is real life. Root dash PDs. Let's try that. There you go. So right now you'll know that we are logged into MySQL because down at the bottom here you can see it says MySQL. So now that I'm inside of MySQL, we're inside of the database management system, right? Remember, MySQL is the database management system. So since we're inside of there, we're going to start communicating, interacting with the system using SQL. So one of the things we can do is do show databases like this, and we're back to using semicolons. And that's going to tell me that I have, let's see, six databases that are on here. Okay. Now, the only one I have personally created is the one that's called test. Okay. And the other ones are used for the lab and for other things. Now, I am going to hazard that the fourth database on there, the SQL lab users, that's going to be the database that's used for the lab, right? So for conducting our SQL injection attack. Okay, so the purpose of this little part over here, though, is really just to go over how databases, just how to interact using SQL. Okay, so because in order for us to conduct a SQL injection attack, we need to know a little bit about SQL. Okay, so I've shown those databases. Let us create a new database. So I'm going to create a database, and let's call it video test. Okay, semicolon. Okay, and then we put the up arrow just to go back, cycle through our history, and you'll see now that I have an extra database down here, so a 7, and the one I have now is called video test. All right, so what else do we want to do? Let me go through my note here. All right, so databases, the way they're organized, we organize them using tables, right? And so you would have a table of information, and then you'd have another table of information. So maybe you'd have a table that is called animal in our database, right? And the animal might have it has a certain list of attributes, and maybe you could have something called type, and one type could be, say, cat, and so you would have another table down here which would give you more details. Okay, I'm really trying to do this on the fly, which is not a good idea, so I'm going to erase what I just did here. But the main idea is that you're going to have a bunch of tables that are all organized, and we're going to give these tables attributes, which are the columns. And then in general, you'll see that we'll link tables together. You are not going to worry about doing any of that in like a 1-week SQL injection attack lab. Okay, so what we're going to do instead is we're just going to work with one table, and we're going to organize our data using that one table. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. First thing, since I've shown these databases, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the video test database. So we're going to use that one. So now that's the database that I'm currently using. Let's do a command. So I'm going to do show tables like that. And you'll see that it's empty. I'm going to do one thing here. I'm just going to minimize this window. I'm going to take a few minutes to adjust. Actually, that's better. I just wanted to minimize the window so it's in the middle of your screen rather than looking down at the bottom. Okay. Okay. So so here we are. We're using the video test database. We went to do show tables. There's nothing in there. There's no tables in there. So let's go ahead and create a table. So I'm going to create a table. I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it animal. And then I'm gonna, by the way, when you don't finish a command, you just do enter, you can just keep typing the command, right? So when I say create table animal, open parentheses, I'm gonna, now every table is going to have something that's unique for that table. So that's going to be our ID. So the first item here, the ID, is the name of it, the name of the column, if you like. And so it's going to be an integer. I'm going to say it has 6 characters. It's going to be not null. I can't have an empty ID. And I'm going to have it auto increment. And the auto increment means it will start at a number 0 or 1, and it will just increment it by 1 every single time. And then I put a column for the next item, so the next attribute. And so the next attribute I have, I'm going to do is name. In this case, I'm going to make it actually, I'll do it as caps. It's easier. Varchar means it's text, right? 30 characters. So it's a variable of characters. There's going to be 30 characters. And again, I'm going to say not null. So the name of, basically the name of the animal is not going to be null. I'm going to say the type of the animal. I'm going to make that a attribute. And the type of the animal, again, I'll do it the same way, is going to have 30 characters. And it's not null. Null. And we're going to do the same for, let's do breed. Oops. Breed, I'm trying to stick with the same thing. So, and then we'll do varchar. And again, let's do 30 characters, not null. And I'm going to just throw in something that's not a char. So we'll put in weight. And then the weight, oops, let's make it, I'm trying to be consistent. And it's that. And let's leave that one as it could be null. Now we have to specify which one of our columns or attributes is the primary key. And so in this case, I'm going to say that ID is our primary key. Okay. And that's our table. And then I'm going to do a close parentheses and a semicolon to end it. Okay. And so when I hit enter, oh, I did get an error. Hang on a second. Oh, I spelled auto increment wrong. So let's go back in. So I did the up arrow, which of course doesn't make it look as nice as I had in the previous one. And I'm going to fix that to now say auto increment. Oh, let's make it capital. I think I spelled it correctly. Okay, now we're good. So I managed to create the table. So let's now do this. Let's do show tables. Okay, so now I see I have my database name, which is video test. I have a table named animal, and I can use another command, which is describe, and I can say, ask it to describe the animal for me, and there you go. It's drawn it as a table. So as you can see here now, is I have a table that has these particular attributes or columns. I have an ID, a name, a type, a breed, and a weight. Okay, that is the table that I have created. Okay, and when you'll see it later on, I'm going to draw it up here. Is the table could be like ID. Just going to copy those. Name, type, breed, and weight. Okay, so there you go. And then what we'll do is we will start adding data to our table. So each of these will be one possible value inside of our table. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to insert a row into our table. Okay, so right now we have this empty table, right, which has these attributes, but now we want to start inserting the details. Okay, so that's what we're going to do over here. So let's go back to the VM over here, and we're going to use the command insert into. That's the command that we're going to use. Now, what we're inserting into is a table named animal, right? Remember, we're using our database called video test. Now we're going to insert into animal, and we're going to insert a name, a type, a breed, and a weight. Okay, and the values we're going to insert are In this case, I'm just going to do, the name is Fiona. It is a cat. Again, simple table. The breed is Siberian and the weight is 11. Okay, and we close that and do a semicolon, right? So notice here, so it's going to basically take in these by order. So Fiona will replace and will go in the name attribute, cat will go in the type, and so on. So if I do that and do enter, oh, what did I miss? Oh, I know what I missed. Okay, I'm just gonna break out of this. Okay, I don't know how to break out of this. Okay, it took me, I did a quick Google search because real life again. And to break out when I mistype is to do Control C. Okay, back into my SQL. But I didn't want to keep that video running while I was doing that. All right, so let's go ahead and retype it. And those of you with better eyes than me may have spotted that I had forgotten an apostrophe right there. And so now if I hit enter, then we're good. Okay. So future, so you know to break out of it is Control C. All right, so now I've inserted one animal in there. Let me insert a second one. I'm just going to insert, I'm going to keep everything the same. I'm just going to change a few of these values. So I'm going to say Fezzik is actually also 17 pounds. He's her brother, but he's a giant, so he's actually a 17-pound cat. Let's say that, and these are all, by the way, our real animals. We had, don't judge us, my daughter got a fish when COVID first started, the pandemic first started, and she named it COVID. So we had a fish named COVID. It's a beta fish. I guess I can call it beta. I don't know what it weighed, but I'll put 0 because I think this is just got to be an integer. You'll be happy to know that COVID, we got COVID in March 2020, and he survived until last month, so March 2022. So he basically lived during the restrictions of COVID. Now all the restrictions have been lifted. He decided not to continue living. So anyway, that's an aside. There's your little Easter egg inside of the video. All right, so those are all of the values I've inserted into the table. Okay, so now what can we do? So now all I've done here is that I've just created one table inside of a database, all to get to this point, which is using the select statement, okay? Because when we do our SQL attacks, we're going to be using the select statements to do our attacks, or some of them, right? It is the most common operation in databases, and it's used to retrieve information from the database. So how does it work? It is simply, you say select, I'll do the simplest, right? If I say select star from animal, and remember animal is the table inside of my database, and so if I do that, then what you'll see is it returned everything, right? So it returned, it showed you the table animal, and that the table has these attributes. Notice the ID is auto incrementing. We have given the name of these animals, the type of the animals, the breed, and the weight of those animals. So it just did everything from inside of there. Okay. We can be more specific. So we can say something like, I don't need all of this data, because you'll find with databases, there can be a lot of information in a table. And when you're doing something, you just want to retrieve certain things. You don't want to retrieve the whole table. And so another example of a command would be to say select, and maybe this time we just want to select the name from animal. So we'll select, it will only show the columns, the name attribute. So in this case, you'll see it only showed that we have, only showed the names of whatever items we had inside of our database. Okay, so with, as you can see, when you're looking at this, you're like, okay, that's great, but if we think about it, the database, right, could be huge, and there could be lots and lots of items, and they should be huge. These databases have lots of tables, and the tables are very full, and you just want to get the data that you need. And so what we use with the select statement, it's also very common, is the where. It's also used with update, which is another command we'll look at, and it's used with delete, right? And so what it does, what the where clause does is whenever the where clause is true, right, it will return the rows, those particular rows. But if the predicate is false, then it will not return those rows. The format for it is you have your SQL statement. So for example, select, right? So select star from table where, and then you have some condition. This predicate can be some condition, and it can, where you're looking for something, if it equals, if the value is the same, or it can be, you can combine the expressions with and or. Okay, and I'm not going to give you a lot of details on that, but please feel free to play with the database, right? You can create your own database and just mess with it to see what you can get. As an example here, let's do a simple expression here, a simple command where I'm going to select the name, right, from animal, okay, which is the name of the table, where, which is our clause, and in this case, let's say where the type equals, and let's go with cat. Okay, so where the type is cat, show me those names. And if you type in enter there, then you'll notice it didn't show COVID, it just showed Fiona and Fezzik, right? And so that's an example of how you can use the where clause. Again, these can be as complicated as you want. If you have a bigger table, you can be like where type equals cat and name starts with F, or and weight equals 17 pounds, or whatever you wanted. Okay, that's what you're going to be using. Okay, there is another statement that we can use, and that is the update statement. And so for the update statement, you can change a value. Okay, so let me do, just to have everything here. So if I do select star from animal, okay, and so we'll have a look at all of that. Let's say we want to update the weight. Let's say we went to the vet, okay? So I'm going to update the animal table, right? So animal, and I'm going to set, so here's another command, the set, and I'm going to set weight to be, let's say the cat needs to go on a diet. So let's say he lost a pound. So we're going to set the weight equals 16, where, and of course this is going to be my boy Fezzik. Okay, it's my giant. And if you know anything about Princess Bride, Fezzik is the giant in the Princess Bride, and this cat is my giant. Okay, so I think that command looks good. I'm going to type in enter. Okay, it worked. Phew. So let me select star from animal. Then it will show me now, there you go, that Fezzik lost a pound and he's now 16 pounds. Okay, so that is our update command in action. All right, what else did I want to say? Oh, I want to talk a little bit about comments, because you'll find comments are actually helpful. All right. The comments inside of SQL, we're going to really just use the pound character. So anything from the pound character to the end of the line is going to be treated as a comment. Okay. You can use a dash dash, and you can use the /* and then you have to end it, and that would be a comment. Okay, and so so let me see if I can give you an example to play with that. Oops, wrong thing. I'm going to just go back here. So let's say I want to say we're going to set the weight. Let's say Fezzik lost another pound. So let's say we're going to set the weight to 15, where name equals Fezzik, and let's say I want to say type equals cat. Okay, so let's say I wanted to do that, or something along those lines. It's not really very smart, but if I wanted to do that, right, and if I ran this command, it should work. But let's say that it didn't work and I'm testing or something. So maybe what I can do is I can end that statement with a semicolon and put a pound here. Okay, And let's say this was type equals fish or something like that. Maybe just made a mistake. Then if what will happen here is it's going to actually run this command, and anything after this pound is going to be ignored. Okay, so the hint here is if you're watching this video and then you're going to be doing the lab, the hint here is you can, when we do our SQL injection attack, you can use this pound sign to comment out some parts of a SQL statement that you might not need. Okay, and so that's my hint. It's at minute 30. There you go for future reference. Now if I hit enter and let's go ahead and select star from animal, we should see that it did indeed change it. Okay, so it just ignored the type equals fish that we had at the end here. Okay, all right, so that's my brief introduction to SQL. I did put a slide here with some of the commands. And don't worry what these examples are using. I'm using a database called database test and a table called employee, but everything else is really just to illustrate the different commands. So all of these commands are in uppercase, right? And so I just wanted a quick reference for you for when you're doing some of the attacks, maybe to look and see what commands you can possibly use. Okay. All right, so I think the last thing I just wanted to do here is talk more about, give you sort of more of an overview about what the lab attack is going to look like, okay? And the way I tried to illustrate this here is we have a browser, the same as before. We have a browser that sends an HTTP request to an application, a web server, which then sends a SQL, right? So this the SQL statement that we've just been using, it sends a SQL statement there. So let me just write that in there. So this is an HTTP request, and then this is a SQL statement. And on the way back, each one of those sends their results, right? So for example, the web application server might send a select star from animal, and then it will send the result, which is the list of all those animals, right? So again, here if we look on the right, so there's select star from animal might be our SQL statement. The result is going to be this table, which we can see here. So then this result is going to be the table, and then the server here will maybe take those results and tidy it up and make it look pretty to send it back to the browser. Okay, that's the kind of the way it works. So just give you an idea of how this might look like. Our person might be sitting here at the web browser, right? And they will, I'm going to try and do this here. This was what they will see inside of the web browser. So inside of the browser, they will see a page that has a title, has a button, whatever it has, and then, but there's a field for them to enter in a username and password. Okay, so this top field says username, the second one says password. Now, if you look at the source for this web page, right, so this is in our browser, in our Firefox. If you right click on this and view the source, you're going to see this text over here, which is actually PHP source, or it's a HTML source, but what you'll find is it has, let me see if I can find it, it will have inside of this form, it's going to have a couple of inputs. So there's an input here, and there's an input down here, right? And the input, if you notice here, has, I'm going to highlight the important parts, has a name, which is username, and here it has a name, which is password, okay? And that's what the user can see. So when the user types in something over here, it's going to be stored in something that has a username. Notice it's all lowercase. And when the user types something in that second box here, it's going to be stored in password, which has an uppercase P. Okay, so that is what gets sent back. That's what's going to get sent back through the HTTP protocol to the server, right? Now we're at the server, and let's see, and this part here, this is our PHP that is operating on the server. So this is our PHP that's operating on the server, and what you'll see it does is it's taking that username, right? Remember all that lowercase username? See that? That's what the user typed in the box. And the password, right? Which again is what the user, ignore that, which is what the user typed in the box. The password with the uppercase P and the username with the all lowercase. So those are those values that it's getting from the get, right? From the command that was sent. And it's storing them in a variable called input uname and input pwd. okay? And the next thing that it's doing is it's running that input PWD, and it's running it through an MD5 hash. So that's what this SHA1 is doing. So it's just gonna hash the password, which basically means it's no longer plain text, right? It takes that plain text and it hashes it. And so that's the password that is now hashed, right? So we have these three variables inside of our PHP. And then what the PHP does, or what we're doing inside of here, is we're constructing creating a variable, but we're constructing a SQL statement using that variable. And so what we're doing is it's using the string. So it's going to be select, and then it's selecting ID, name, EID, salary, birth, all of these things, right? These items, these attributes from a table named credential. That's what this part here is. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. There we go. There we go. So again, let's go back to the type of the SQL statement. So we're going to use select, and it's selecting all of these items from a table that's named credential, where, and this is our conditions, our where clause, where the name equals input uname. So the input uname is that variable that we have up here, and the password equals, right? So the password, now this is a password that is the attribute inside of our table, right? The column inside of our table. And so where the password equals the hash password that we have out here. So in other words, what it's going to do is for the user whose username is this and its password is this, it's going to display all of these values, right? And so what we do is we take that SQL statement and we throw it into this command called query, and it's going to run that SQL statement, send the results, and then the results are going to go back to the user, okay? So that's kind of a summary of the process. So now when you are going to be running your attack, what you've got to figure out is how could you type something inside of here, right, inside of the username, that you know is going to go from username to username, or yeah, to username, and then used in input uname inside of this SQL. So what could you type inside of input uname or username that could modify the SQL statement so that you can do something malicious? Okay, and that's what you're going to be doing in the lab. You're going to be viewing things you shouldn't be viewing. You're going to be changing people's salaries that you shouldn't be changing, that kind of thing, all through these little boxes, but knowing what these PHP and these commands look like, right? So you can kind of know and guess, right? So SQL injection attack is really all about creativity, the creativity of the attacker to manipulate the SQL statements for their own nefarious purposes. And there you go. Good luck.